This session, we are talking about U.S. China technology competition and Europe's role in it. And with me, we have three absolutely fantastic panelists. On my left is Ellie from the Financial Times. She is the Beijing technology correspondent. And Saul Klein, who is based in the UK now, is a serial entrepreneur and a government advisor now. And Jing Qian needs no introduction. He spoke to us early this morning, and he's the founder and director of Center for China Analysis at Asia Society. Now, since this panel is talking about U.S. China tech competition and Europe's role in it, I thought I should start with Ellie, if I may, to talk about the Chinese perspective on the state of play between U.S. and China over technology. And I'll go to Jing to ask for American perspective, and then we reserve the bright spot to Saul to talk about how Europe makes sense of all of this. Over to you.
Thank you, Vincent. Very excited to be here from Beijing. So the Chinese perspective on the US-China tech race, I think there's multiple layers to this question. Obviously, you've got the state response, you've got the company response, and you've got the kind of citizen response. If we start from the kind of political element, obviously there is a very intense race going on here. It matters immensely to China that they are winning and dominant in AI. I think there's a recognition here that they are behind, and as much as Jensen Huang kind of talks up the abilities of Huawei, you know, the US absolutely has a very firm lead in hardware and the AI chips, which is obviously the important thing powering this technology. But really there's a kind of split in the government, the camp that's saying, let's push forward the domestication, let's push forward Huawei, Capricorn, and yes, that means we're going to have a bit of a delay and we're going to be behind the US for a number of years, but it's a kind of painful process that we need to go through. We need to eat bitterness to get to the front. And that certainly is kind of what is happening on one side. And then there's the kind of more pragmatic element, which is saying we need to work with the US and buy as much US technology as possible. And really you're seeing both things happening at the same time. It's not one or the other. And they're being kind of very strategic, flipping between the different strategies, which means that being a journalist on this beat is always a fun topic. You then have the companies, again, extreme, I mean, this word keeps coming up, but being extremely pragmatic. I wrote a piece last week about how all of the major leading Chinese labs are accessing Claude. Claude is so anti-China. Like Dario could not be more of a China basher, and yet, you know, these guys are like, we don't care. They're the best. We've got to use them, right? So they find mechanisms to access the best technology and to keep going. But, you know, it's a question of how long that gap remains. And then I think on the user base, I think there's a certain extent to which people don't really care that much. You know, they want to be using the best technology. In fact, I think there is quite a pro sentiment towards AI generally amongst the Chinese public. You know, I don't think they're such evil hate figures as some of these AI entrepreneurs are becoming in America. So again, it's kind of what's cheapest and what's best. I think big picture, there's a really interesting dynamic going on between the US and China AI race, which we might be missing out on. Of course, I think American models are leading and the gap kind of goes from 12 months to 3 months. But maybe there's a world in which actually that works in China's favor. Maybe there's a world in which China can watch what's happening in the US and say, okay, that's the path I don't want to follow, and put up guardrails for employment, on social media, on censorship, and kind of figure out the way that they want to implement AI that doesn't look like it is being implemented in the US and elsewhere.
I thought the citizen response is quite interesting. Is there also in China the similar kind of anxiety as in the West about AI replacing jobs and kind of discontent, despite the fact that they are, as you said, they are promiscuous about, you know, what kind of tools they use as long as they are cheap?
I think it's definitely there. It's difficult to separate from the fact that the labor market is weak already, and it's been very weak in places where AI would be replacing jobs. I mean, you only have to look at the employment prospects of Tsinghua Beida graduates for the past 5 years and know that the world looks very different today than it did 10 years ago. The companies need to be very careful around their messaging here. I mean, I've spoken to a number of tech CEOs who, would like to do mass layoffs. Actually, it's quite hard to fire people in China, surprisingly. So, but they just say that they're not hiring. And that's the way that they get around this, because they're not going to see a stock market boost from laying off 10% of their workforce. That's not something that they want to be seen to be doing. But it's certainly a conversation, but as I said, it's just difficult to separate from the kind of broader macro picture.
Right, fascinating, thank you. Jing, over to you. What is Washington's thinking on the state of play between US and China over tech?
First of all, thank you very much for the mixing up that I can't really speak for DC. I can't either speak for China, right? The Center for China Analysis is really trying to be as objective as possible. But maybe I can try to help to provide some of our own research and thinking on how to understand the U.S.-China technological both competition and collaboration with Europe in mind with 3 case studies. One is on AI, as Eleanor already touched on, and I very much agree is on the multi-layer. And I will bring, again, Jensen Huang's 5 layers of the cake, which is easier to elaborate. And I will ask Raya, the boss, to help to project on biotech later on to elaborate the second point. You can spend some time to read that, which is based on a recent paper we have produced called Beyond the Biotech Race. And third one, I'll touch on clean tech. I'll spend about 1 minute or 2 on each. On AI, it's fairly well known now, the 5 layers. The number 1 is on chips and computing, as you already said. I think the US is still very much in the lead with China catching up. Different assessments as the gap is different, right? I think we have a tech expert who can touch on that. But on the model and the algorithm, it's very much a closed model versus open model now. I think the frontier open model is still leading, but the frontier closed model is leading, but the security issue of whether the closed model can have a plug to finish you or to stop you has really posed a huge security concern for governments and companies who are using this. So I've been advocating for US really needs to have its own open source model out there to compete with open source model by China. A Chinese open source model, funny, right, in an authoritarian regime, and open source model globally has been taking a competitive edge. Singaporean government, as you all know, has taken the Chinese open source model going forward for its own security consideration. So I think the second one, I think still on core capacity comprehensive, the US is in the lead, but China is really catching up in different ways, right, in more comprehensive way. The third one's on data and talent. And this is how I have to say it's in 2 bifurcated world, and I don't know which one's data is slightly better than the other. The distillation of data is actually mutual nowadays. And the fourth one is on application and adoption. Apparently, China is currently in the lead in the diffusion, not only within the Chinese context, but globally. And the last one is on the energy and the governance side. And China is leading apparently on the energy side, but on the governance side, I have to say China might also is going slightly more progressive with its own domestic regulation. So on the AI side, that's a multi-layer. Again, as I said, I try to put a framework on the table for us to understand this in a more multi-layered way. And on the biotech side, which is another emerging battlefield, now, Randall, if you please project that one on the screen. This is based on 6 months of research we have done. And this is where I want to leave on the table with a strong note. I think if Europe is somehow missed the US-China AI competition, Europe has a major role to play in the incoming biotech competition, given the strong players of biotech and biopharmaceutical companies that is in Europe. Again, we have to think this in multi-layered, right? I'm not going to repeat that, but you can see in basic science, US still in the leading, in the target discovery, US still in the leading, but in the preclinical testing, clinical trials, China is actually in leading. In the past year, China is doing more than 50% of clinical trials globally. But in the regulatory side, the US FDA standards is still the gold standards on a global scale, but the European standard is also in the leading. And on the manufacturing side, the Chinese manufacturing capacity is dominating, both in Asia and beyond. But in the commercialization side, the US market is still 60% of most innovative drugs. So Chinese market still relies on that, and the VC ecosystem is still very much US dominated. But US China is getting into a biotech race nowadays very unnecessarily. Now I think that presents a very good strategic opportunity for Europe. And this allow me 1 minute, because this race will get into a point that put people's life at risk, right? If they don't understand how this ecosystem work, with politics prevail, slow down the clinical trials on both sides, very easily people won't get the drugs that is coming with Chinese data. Just imagine ourselves in the shoes of US congressional member. I can't give this drug to you because it has Chinese data, but this drug can save your life. How are you going to make that choice? It's a very difficult political choice. And of course, there's many guardrails on data security and data safety and data quality that we can put in place as we audit public companies' data regime. So that's the second one. We can get into that if we have time. And third one is on clean tech. I think clean tech is not really a race anymore. I think that's pretty a consensus when China is producing 70% of the EV, 70% of the battery, and 90% of the solar panels, right? We have a Professor Guo, who is a member of the CCA, who will talk about in the next panel. But remember that China now has, on the paper, 109 EV companies, but off the record, more than 200 EV companies. The involution competition is severe with the market, with a profit margin of about 1.5, 1.6%. They need to go abroad. I won't use the word exporting overcapacity, but they have to find a way to form joint ventures in Europe. But we have, in the Europe, let me put my shoes on into the European governments, we have to find a way to hold them to the European environment and labor standards. The current deals need to be better negotiated to have the technological know-how to be transferred to build a local industry capacity. That can be done. That can be done in a political and policy savvy way. I'll leave that. We can get into that as well.
I think this is a really good segue to Saul, talking about Chinese products coming to Europe. There's a lot of talk and concern about so-called China Shock 2.0. China Shock 2.0. What is the sort of European perspective on the U.S. China tech competition and China's massive exports to Europe?
Firstly, thank you for asking someone who's based in London to give a European perspective.
Well, the UK, despite...
No, I think because this is an evidence-based room, when you look at the innovation economy, and I'll just read the numbers here, the amount of VC funding in London is Paris, Tel Aviv, Dubai, Berlin, Stockholm, and Munich put together. So thank you for including me in this conversation. And I say that as a South African, not as a Brit, because I've been an immigrant in Britain for 50 years now, other than the decade I spent in America.
If I may add, the UK government will always say, despite Brexit, we are still European.
Well, what I would say is we've been trading with France for about 1,000 years. We've been trading between Ipswich and Bruges and Ghent for about 800 years. And in fact, in those days, Suffolk and that part of Belgium were the richest places in the world. And so, trade matters. And I think, not to just sort of be controversial here, because, I can be as a Brit in Paris, who's South African, and my location on Twitter, I'll still call it Twitter, is the internet, is America's lost badly, cannot win on any innovation vector anymore. And, my read, having been in the innovation economy for 35 years now, over half my life and all of my professional life, is that America doesn't like to lose. And all that's happening, because Biden was the same as Trump, is that they are playing out, as teenagers do, in an epic extractive tantrum. And, you know, on any vector, batteries, robots, even on AI, they've lost. It's just a question of time. So then, if you're not American and you're not Chinese, the question, you know, if I was a classicist as opposed to a humanities graduate, is how do you sail between Scylla and Charybdis? You know, it's like, what is the route between these two superpowers? And guess what? There are a lot of other countries in the world. So I think it's just an incredible time if you're not American.
Ellie, is that how Beijing see things as well? I mean, U.S. cannot win, and it's an incredible time for not being American.
Yeah, okay, there's so much there. So let's get back to this China 2.0 phrase, which after WEF is now China Shock 2.0, which is now a banned phrase. Li Chang at the WEF forum in Dalian pointed out some unfriendly media, which I think the FT was fairly early on in calling it the China 2.0 shock. And he rephrased it as the China Opportunities 2.0. So let's see how that catches on. But I see this, I mean, it's an important theme that has come up so many times in today's discussions. But just if I can give a little bit of color as to what this means on a granular basis. I kind of travel around China and report on a lot of kind of niche industries, and often it's focusing on the niche industries that you truly understand the combination of state policy and entrepreneurial innovation, because if you go to the semiconductors, the EVs, it's too sensitive, they're not going to talk to you. So I went to Mangshi, which is on the border with Myanmar, to look at the epicenter of macadamia nut production, which is obviously a very important story. But this is fascinating, right? Like, China didn't have any macadamia nuts a decade ago. They imported them from Australia. Now they're number 2 producer in the world. They're soon going to take over South Africa, which is the number 1 producer. And I was chatting to this Laoban, the boss, and I said, you know, why have you done this? Like, what's your goal here? And he's like, we want to beat the next door town. Like, that is our goal. The next door town wants to beat them. The Yunnan province wants to be number 1 in the world, and that literally is their goal. So they're going to be providing support on export subsidies, transferring the agricultural land from rice to macadamia nuts, and it's this kind of whole ecosystem support. And you see it just time and time again. There's basically nothing that China won't touch. You know, and this is obviously a huge problem for Europe. We're seeing kind of the destruction of a lot of value in luxury. You've only got to look at the lab-grown diamond industry to understand that. So, you know, it's very real, but I think a lot of this happens kind of without the true awareness. It's not like it's this operation that's being directed from Beijing and they're thinking, let's destroy the South African macadamia nut farmers. It's quite organic, and it's very kind of grassroots led, but following a direction which is set by the top leadership.
Interesting. Jing, going back to you, China, Center for China Analysis in Asia Site has been doing quite a lot of reports on the state of China's economy, etc. I mean, we talk about this so-called China Shock 2.0 or China Opportunity 2.0. Do you think the current economic situation in China is only exacerbating this whole problem here?
Thank you. I tend to agree with the assessment just now, and I think last year we talked about the multi-layered Chinese economy as well, right? As a part of Chinese economy, it's functioning extremely well. The productively gained from either AI or clean tech or state-backed sectors are performing very well. The K-shape of economy has gained popularity nowadays. But also the other part of Chinese economy is really getting flat or going down. But I also want to say there's people's feeling is in the States the same thing, right? The macroeconomy is doing so well. Top 10% is consuming 50%, manufacturing 50%, and consuming token 80 to 90%. Similarly in China too. But the difference here, I think, is the Chinese people's grievances and the unsatisfaction level, I think it's relatively much lower, and they don't have a formal mechanism to reflect those into policy making nor into the political process. I give you one anecdote, and it's not actually anecdote, it's my own experience in the past trips to China. I tend to like to go into the Uber and Lyft and in Chinese, Didis and others, and talk with the drivers and go to local restaurants. So I went to the third, fourth tier cities and talk with them, like, what's your annual income? How do you feel like the regime and all those sort of things? They tend to open up to me. I don't think they're so unhappy, right? Their annual income averagely, it's about 70K RMB. They all have their properties now because it's relatively cheaper. They don't have to worry much about medical insurance because 农社保 or whatever social insurance and medical insurance covers about 7 to 80% of the medical expenditures. They don't have much worry about consumption because inflation is very severe, and so that drives down the daily consumption to a very low point. They don't have much, if you will, desire or means to get access to a lot of unhappy news, and all of the news is how US really is screwed up, right? You know, there's gun violence every single day, right? The people are very unhappy with Trump, and Trump is constructing China in a very positive way, 川建国, right? So I think people's level of satisfaction of the government is relatively stable. I won't say high. And among the youth, even the employment rate is very high. But I don't think those are really reflected into the current political process in any meaningful way either. And on the other side, the civilian state and also the repressive regime to kind of suppress down any kind of points of dissatisfaction. So even though the economy is performing like that, I don't think it's reflected into the adjustment of the economic policy. The supermajority of the resources is still driving towards the national priorities of technological advancement.
So I want to come to you. So in the UK, for example, right, there's been quite a lot of rethinking about how to deal with China in the time of great changes in, you know, international order, especially America's commitment to its allies and its place in the world. How would you advise, say, the next incoming UK government on navigating China-US competition over technology? What is the opportunity there for, say, the Andy Burnham government, the presumptive new prime minister coming into the office?
Well, I mean, my observation, having been on the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology for 6 years, which I think has been 5 prime ministers, 7 chancellors, and 10 science ministers, is that, you know, the overall policy environment for innovation, regulation, governance, supporting science and technology, in my experience, has been pretty consistent actually since the late 90s. So Blair, Brown, Cameron, Osborne, it really doesn't matter on some level. And one of the reasons it matters less is that generally, and obviously any civil service can be better, we've got really, really good civil service in the UK. And actually, again, the relationships that the civil service has with many of their counterparts, you know, not just in other countries in Europe, but in Asia and in America, when you have to manage crazy American situations, is also pretty stable. So, I mean, I tend not to sort of look at the short clock of who's in Downing Street. I kind of look at more the long clock of like, what is the 50-year wave on policy or on innovation? And I think, you know, the American wave, the 60-year wave of America dominating global innovation narrative, and then everything else that comes downstream of that, capital, R&D, AI, blah, 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 that is shifting. And it's not just shifting to China, it's after China and the US, in spite of our capital markets, in spite of the lack of institutional investment in the UK and Europe, the UK's got the third biggest innovation economy in the world on any metric. So you could say, which I do, is that the UK and Europe have a 150-year window of opportunity now because America is playing out, and because even my 11-year-old knows you don't put all your eggs in one basket. And if all you can do is buy American, you can't just buy American. I mean, even if you're buying 10% non-American, because you're not allowed to buy Chinese, although you can, like the Singaporean government or Amazon, take a Frontier Model -1 and make it awesome. And by the way, something that is custom, protects your data, unlike Anthropic and OpenAI, that are both house of cards. I think we're in a really, really good position, and I think this Prime Minister, and he will be the next Prime Minister, one of the things he really knows how to do, which most former Prime Ministers have not known how to do, is to run something. He's run a city, he's run a region, he's run the second largest economy in the UK, Greater Manchester, and he's done it really well. So good luck to him.
Ali, Keir Starmer went to China earlier this year, and now we're having a new Prime Minister coming into the office very soon. And Saul talked about the opportunities in the UK. Oh, sorry. Ali, Keir Starmer went to China earlier this year, and we are having a new Prime Minister coming into the office very soon. And Saul talked of the opportunities in the UK and the potential and all these investments in the country. Is this also how Beijing sees the opportunities in the UK and beyond in the wider Europe?
In terms of accessing the market?
Yeah, accessing the market and the opportunities. Because the media framing of the technology is always just about US and China, right?
Yeah.
Europe is always stereotyped as a continent full of regulation, constant discussion, but not much innovation breakthrough. How Beijing sees this?
I mean, in reality, the UK obviously is a relatively small trading partner for China if you compare it to some of the other markets, but they are very much taking a strategic perspective against Europe. I mean, if I do foresee in the next few years Europe getting their act together and coming up with some policy proposals, tariffs that would be incredibly threatening to Beijing. We might even be there right now if we didn't have Trump in the White House. I mean, everything we're seeing is extremely problematic for a lot of the French companies, the German companies. And that kind of tipping point of when do you start to take action against China, because we obviously don't want to relinquish access to the market. What point, really, that's the critical question, at what point does that answer start tipping in the favor of tariffs? The UK does have a kind of slightly unique position there. We don't sell a whole bunch of manufactured goods to China. I think some crazy percentage of our exports are just basically cars. So we're one of the kind of countries they can spill off and try and kind of create this divide and rule tactic, I suppose.
Can I just say, though, I think it might be we're looking at it the wrong way. You don't have to be the biggest customer to be a lighthouse customer. BT was Huawei's first customer. And, I guarantee you the secret side did the analysis and said it was okay. Politically, it was not okay later. And, there is no VW, there is no AstraZeneca without, the Greater Bay Area and the access to, clinical trials, manufacturing know-how. I mean, Apple learned that lesson hard. So, the question is, how do we work together, not how do we, build bigger walls?
Yeah, no, that's certainly true.
Great. We've got about 5 minutes left. If you have any questions, please do raise your hands or submit your questions through this barcode. Ryan.
I have a question that just came in the time that we set it up on the screen here. The first question is from PS, whoever you are. How does China perceive and address the multiplication of VPN use domestically?
Wow, what a niche question.
In order to have access to Anthropic, Claude.
Oh my God, VPN. It's so nice to get off the plane and not have to connect to my VPN. It's like this breath of fresh air. It's even better than not breathing polluted air. Look, like VPNs are there because they need them. And obviously, if you're a financial institution, you need to get access to the best data, etc. They mysteriously stop working when there are certain events happening. So it's not a tool to evade the views of the censors or the authorities because it's very explicitly there for a reason. And in fact, you probably are using VPNs which are maybe made by companies who also have connections with authorities who are also doing the surveillance. Honey traps? Yeah. I don't know, there's this guy that comes and checks on me from time to time, and I think maybe he's a honey trap, but they need to, I think they might need to upgrade his wardrobe a little bit if that's gonna be successful. But yes, VPNs are there, and it's a simulation. Yeah.
Great. Two more minutes. Got another question. Does the central government, I suppose the central government in China, see the competition between provinces as a structural problem, and how is it balancing local incentives with national industrial objectives? Jing, would you like to take that question?
Sure. We do at the Center for China Analysis has the pretty comprehensive project to re-investigate the 新行政机关, which is a low KPI system of the Chinese official. Take a step back. I think there's three key pillars of so-called Chinese economic miracle. One is the decentralization, is the central government to give a local government a lot of incentives to compete against each other. Two is a global market after China joined WTO. And third one is private entrepreneurs. I think the central government is trying to do three things at the same time. The early February 2025, right? She's meeting with all the private entrepreneurs, including Ren Zhengfei, Deep Sea Guy, and Jack Ma, was to try to revitalize the private entrepreneur spirit. We'll see how that goes. And I think the same year, March 29th, I think she also had a symposium with a bunch of multinational companies. And some of them actually launched a pretty massive investment in China. But the third one is the most difficult one, is to reinvent the KPIs locally. As you can imagine, it used to be GDP. If you develop the economy, you get promoted. Fairly simple. Even if you're a little bit corrupted, it's fine along the way, as long as you deliver. But now it's 不为 GDP, not only in GDP, but anything else is difficult to measure, even loyalty, right? As loyal as you can get, as Mr. Zhang Youxia, you will be purged. And loyalty is extremely subjective. Then what is a new KPI system? I think that is what that question is about, but it's also what the 新行政机关, the new KPI incentive structure that the central government is trying to set up. Read our papers, given we don't have much time. Get to the website. We'll put some promotions materials outside in the door, but it's along the side of political legitimacy, is how they can uphold the ruling of the Communist Party. Two is still governance and economic performance along the side of technological advancements we discussed quite a bit. And third one is actually social welfare, because that is a key element of the new regime that's trying to deliver for the people for both social stability reasons and political legitimacy reasons.
Great, thank you. Saul has the last word.
I was just going to say, I think that's so interesting. I hadn't really thought about it or known about it in that way. But when I think about what the the current Prime Minister Keir Starmer was talking about, and I think, what a lot of the European models actually excel at is this kind of, Starmer would talk about inclusive innovation, and it's looking at a deprivation index at a ward level and saying, how do I kind of minimize the spread of inequality? And people used to look at Sweden or the Netherlands or Denmark and say, these are just like broken, and clearly they are not. So I think it's actually quite interesting. We talk about an innovation economy that is built on purpose and values and about reducing inequality. And you could say that, well, that's kind of socialist, or you could just say that's sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, we are about to finish. Our next panel is with Cui Wen, and we're talking about sustainability. Thank you very much for staying with us.